I came to COVA, I was actually an undergrad student here, and they introduce you to new materials. I knew pencils, I knew textures, but there's a edge to it, a predictability, there's a history and a culture to those materials which I didn't respond to, and I always found my drawing incredibly overworked and heavy. But the unpredictability of the charcoal, the rubbing in of it, the layering, the dirtiness of it, for me there was a freedom, and there was a kind of, as I said before, a rupture, something that I couldn't control completely. And that lines up beautifully to me to how the landscape works, the weather, how things change. The way that we've been brought up at university in a Western way of seeing things as recessive space, things going off in the distance, it's not really how we operate in the landscape. We take staccato views of things. We're kind of rapidly recording things. So I was interested in how to record that in drawing, and I found that if I drew things in detail and did layered views of them, it kind of lined up more with how I operated and how I see in the landscape. The reason I wanted to talk about this technique was to talk about the process and the materiality of the charcoal and the way it takes to the paper and what you can actually do with it on the paper. Charcoal is basically made from burnt timber. It traditionally comes from willow, and when people think of willow sticks, it's probably the most common used charcoal. It's long and thin and snaps very easily. The way the charcoal is actually compressed in various processes will mean the kind of mark that it makes. And one of the reasons that I use this square soft compressed charcoal is it'll make a mark on my hand. You can see it's very soft and malleable, whereas some of the other charcoals won't. They won't make a mark on my hand, or very little. So for what I want to do, moving the material around on the surface, these ones don't make the kind of mark that I want, whereas that piece of charcoal will. There's more material on the surface that I can actually push around. One of the reasons that I use this white vinyl rubber is if I use a soft rubber, it won't affect the charcoal as much. But again, conversely, if I make a drawing with a harder charcoal, when I try to rub it out, it'll be rubbed out very differently because there's less material on the surface, whereas the soft compressed charcoal, I can push the material around on the surface more and get that unexpected thing that can happen because there's basically just more material there that I can play with and push around. The use of paper is really important with this, and what I've found is if you have a paper that is actually quite dense and smooth, the charcoal won't take to it as easily as a paper that actually has a decal to it. So I prefer a heavy watercolour paper because it actually has a texture to it, so the mark, the actual material will sit in the paper more, so I can actually get more value out of the charcoal on the surface. So the paper itself is really important. The smooth paper I don't prefer, but some students might, and I'd suggest to try different kinds of paper and actually decide what works for you and your technique. One of the reasons that I love using soft compressed charcoal is because of that malleability, the materiality of it. I can push it around on the surface really quickly, and one of the mistakes that a student can make when they're using charcoal is thinking that they have to use it like a pencil or a biro trying to find a fine edge. I think it should be used in a very different way, and that's about spreading and taking the material off or putting material on. So it's quite a different material, and it takes some getting used to. With the whiter the paper, a lot of people don't realise, unless you're a watercolour painter, because they actually technically use the white background as the white rather than add white. It's the same with drawing with charcoal too, or any drawing on paper, to actually realise the potential of that whiteness. So what I'm going to do is to make a drawing where the white becomes the bone itself and work with the background. The great advantage again of the charcoal is I can hold it on its side, it's soft compressed, the material is really malleable, and you can see how quickly I can cover the surface of the paper. And I'm being really brutal, really rough, because my idea of drawing is if I'm dealing with natural things or working outside, the landscape itself is quite brutal and rough, so why shouldn't that be part of the drawing? I end up with charcoal all over me. I think that's fine too, evidence of me working. You can see I'm building up the surface of the charcoal. Once I've got a fair bit of material there, best tools you have can be your hands. Rubbing the charcoal into the surface of the deckled watercolour paper. And if I work long enough on this, I can actually get a really dense, rich, velvety black that will emphasise, as I was saying earlier, the whiteness of the paper, which will help in the description of the bone itself. And me now looking at the whiteness of that bone compared to kind of white grey, pure whites and other mid-tone greys in there, what I'll do is push the material back across the surface, and to do that I use that vinyl rubber again, pushing the bone back into the background. The reason I rotate the paper too is so I'm not being precious about pushing the material around in one direction. Then what I can do is use the edge. Remember, it's a rubber that'll have charcoal over it, but you can actually clean the rubber if you want, and you can use an edge of it to actually give us the pure white. And you can see now the form and the mass of the bone, the volume of the bone's kind of appearing from that mid-tone grey. Might even draw back into it as well. And you can see the way that I used both the soft compressed charcoal and the rubber in an unorthodox manner provided a kind of break or a rupture in it. And for me, there's a nice correlation between what the charcoal did and what the rubber did with what the actual bone has in it, the qualities and textures of it. Because I'm using this soft compressed charcoal, it's really malleable. You can see it's all on my hands. It will move around a lot. So you'll have to fix it at various times on the paper and when you're actually working on it, and also at the end when you want to make sure the material stays. So spraying 20 centimetres away, moving it, lightly spraying, and try and use it always in a ventilated area, otherwise the stuff that's in it could be quite bad for you. I would love people with their drawing to make it personal. The reason that I got to the place with the drawing where hopefully I'm making some contribution to drawing is because I found a personal way of seeing the landscape and then was able to turn that and make that into drawing. So my advice would be go with something personal and don't be scared to try lots of different things. And even if you stumble on something that's exciting, from there you can build a practice.